Okay. Welcome everybody. Today we have a great presentation lined up. We have a group of students who have been working diligently on a NCWRC funded project, urban deer ecology across a rural continuum. So we have 4 presenters for today. We're going to start with Ashley Lynn. Ashley graduated with her master's about a year ago in Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Biology from NC State. Currently, she's a lab manager in an immunology lab at the NC State College of Veterinary Medicine. And this coming admission cycle, she'll be applying to PhD programs so she can start answering some of her own burning research questions. And she wants you all to know that she recently got an Instant Pot and has been making a lot of soup. Then we're going to have Micaiah Carver-McGinn present. Micaiah is a PhD candidate in the FWCB program. Her research focuses on how urbanization affects white-tailed deer ecology, including their movement patterns, resource selection, and mortality risks across urban-rural gradients. She earned her BS in Geography and MS in Wildlife and Wildlands Conservation from Brigham Young University, where she studied the impact of feral horses on greater sage-grouse populations. Next up, we have Jared Lamb. Jared grew up in Salisbury, North Carolina, and completed his undergraduate also in the FWCB program. He worked as a lead technician in the Gila Wilderness of New Mexico on an elk and Mexican gray wolf project before joining the deer project as a lead technician in 2021, and then gained his position as a graduate student in 2023. He aspires to work as a wildlife biologist for the state of North Carolina after graduation. Hannah DeRoche is our final presenter. She recently earned her PhD in the FWCB program, where her doctoral research was focused on the intersection of social science and natural resource management, specifically looking at the human dimensions of urban deer management in Durham County. Hannah is currently working for the Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center as a postdoc, where she is working to synthesize the state of climate adaptation science and practice in the Southeast and the Caribbean, with the ultimate goal of improving understanding and accessibility of the available climate adaptation science in the region. And in her free time, Hannah enjoys being outside, running, playing volleyball, or doing yoga and watching movies. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ashley, and she is going to get us started. Go ahead.
Hello, everyone.
Oh, I think you're muted, Ashley.
Can you hear me now?
You're good. It was me muted. Go ahead.
Okay. So let's share. And everyone can see my title slide. So thank you guys for being here. This presentation is based on my graduate work and is titled Fecal DNA Reveals Declining Deer Density as Urbanization Increases. So what exactly is an urbanization gradient? We define these gradients by how much the landscape is altered. And the photos here show the main 3 classifications we use: rural, suburban, and urban. And this is just a snapshot of these classifications based on what we see on the ground. But when shown on satellite imagery, the conversion of natural areas is easily seen as we move along the gradient. Towards the urban landscape, we see an increase in houses, roads, and shopping centers. Each of these areas has some type of wildlife, but that wildlife is dependent on the level of urbanization that area has. White-tailed deer are a generalist species and live in a variety of landscapes. And urbanization can affect the population dynamics of deer and results in deer density varying across the urbanization gradient. Because of this, conflicts arise in all areas of the gradient, resulting in the need to understand deer density at a landscape level. So our objective was to estimate deer density along an urbanization gradient. The study took place in Durham County, North Carolina, which contains over 330,000 people, primarily concentrated within the central and southern parts of the county. Land in the north is considered rural, and in the central and southern parts, it's considered suburban and urban. Private land makes up 95% of this county, with the remaining 5% being recreational areas and parks. We used impervious surface as a proxy for urbanization in the project. Within each site, which are the white circles on that map, I averaged impervious surface percent. Overall, the least impervious site was at 1% here at the northern part of the county, and the most impervious was at 55% here in the central part of the county. When we look at the gradient from a county level, blue versus yellow, it seems straightforward, but we wanted to actually understand what was happening at a finer scale once we zoom into the county. We used genetic spatial recapture, capture-recapture for our overall methods. We had multiple plots per sampling site, in which within each of these plots, we survey for fecal materials and use genetics to ID that fecal material. On the back end, we use modeling to estimate density and density across the gradient. The major issue we faced is the amount of private property in Durham County, which doesn't allow for typical transect sampling that is used. So traditionally, transects are used in these studies where a continuous line is placed on the landscape and you collect fecal samples as you walk along it. However, you need big pieces of land, and this type of sampling only occurs with continuous pieces of land, and only 5% of land in Durham County is public, so this type of sampling wasn't going to work in an urban setting because if I place that same exact line here in a neighborhood, we run into a lot of private property. And the probability of getting access to all those houses is low. So we needed a different sampling design, and we chose a cluster sampling design. So essentially, in the rural area on the left, we had continuous access, and we were allowed to put down uniform plots. But on the right, this is actually a neighborhood, and we use parcels, which are outlined in blue, as our plots. And so while these two might look different, it allowed for consistent sampling design with the additional complexity of homeowner access along the gradient that we knew we would run into. So in order to get access to all this land, I worked within the communities and conducted outreach to gain access to private properties. Through door knocking, flyers, and word of mouth, 120 private property owners allowed access to their lands, with the majority being single-family homeowners. Other private properties like HOAs, churches, and schools were also helpful. And of course, public lands like city parks and game lands also gave large pieces of property, which allowed me to put more plots on the landscape. So we used non-invasive genetic sampling with fecal DNA, and we searched for fecal material like the ones you see on the right. These are actually all examples of deer fecal material we found in our searches. And DNA exists on the outside of each of these pellets, and we use it to detect individual deer. Also, there's no capture or handling of animals, which allows us to be flexible with where we collect data, and that came in handy when working in urban areas or areas with private property. So once I have fecal samples, I start a process called genotyping. First, I take the DNA from the pellets through DNA extraction. I run each extraction through a PCR where I make a ton of copies of the DNA. I then look for matching deer from all the DNA samples, and eventually I get individual deer identification. I take those individual deer and start modeling. And we allow density to vary by impervious surface, which gets us that result at that landscape level that I talked about. And we generate a density surface map and total abundance of deer within the county as our final results. So surveys took place in February, March of 2023, and we visited 353 plots throughout our 7 sites. Most sites were visited 3 times. However, sites S2 and S3 were visited 4 times due to weather events. We cannot be out there when it rains because the DNA degrades from the fecal pellets. So the overall goal was to have 50 to 60 plots per sampling site, and we were able to achieve that in 5 of our 7 sites. However, urban plots were hard to solidify due to fewer areas of suitable deer habitat, so we ended up having to cut quite a few plots in those sites. In total, 130 plots detected deer, and we collected 642 fecal samples. In total, we had 380 individual deer, 253 males, and 127 females. These figures show where these samples were found. Majority of them were collected in the rural areas at the top of the county shown in green, and fewest were in the urban areas in the central of the county shown here in purple. Now, a major result that we found, one of the biggest and most exciting, was that density actually does decline as impervious surface increases. So our model estimated that there were 50 deer per square kilometer or 130 deer per square mile in the entire county. Now, this graph you see here shows density on the y-axis and impervious surface percent on the x-axis. So as impervious surface increases, we see a decline in deer density, and that correlates to those urban areas that were in kind of the city of Durham and the surrounding metropolitan areas. We created a density surface map, And so this is basically a heat map where you can think of the dark colors as higher deer density and the lighter colors as lower deer density. Now, the total amount of usable deer habitat in Durham County was 742 square kilometers, and we estimated about 23,700 deer total in the county. And that averages out to about 32 deer per square kilometer. Once again, we wanted to know, though, what was happening at a finer scale. So I wanted to kind of zoom in on some of my sites just to show you what it looks like against satellite imagery. So here's one of our more suburban sites that we had. And compared against satellite imagery, it's possible to see how the landscape starts to vary even at this scale, but the density surface map seems to match what we see at satellite imagery. So the lower density edges of the sampling site, where it shows the most shopping centers and neighborhood, correspond to the lowest densities that my model actually put out. And if I zoom in even further to that, we can see an area that's estimating 0 deer per square kilometer, and that correlates to a huge urban area where there's a shopping center, a high school, and while there is still some green space around, it's still not great suitable habitat for deer because the connectivity is rather low. And if I now contrastly, if we move that to an area where estimated higher deer densities, we see that it's a lot of canopy cover, continuous green space, large areas, things that deer prefer when moving around and living in areas. So it's cool to see how the finer scale really shows deer habitat a bit better. And it's important to have a complete picture of your study area because while this density map of the whole county is cool, it doesn't really tell us a lot about what's happening at a landscape level, like these more specific sampling site estimates do. And so having both and pinpointing areas where additional research needs to be is important when creating deer density, especially along an urbanization gradient. So the overall conclusion, the main one that we found, is that there is a negative correlation between impervious surface and deer density. High impervious surfaces, like in downtown Durham, had 0 deer per square kilometer, an outcome that's not really surprising given the lack of suitable connectivity. Plot-based sampling allowed surveying in suburban neighborhoods, and we ended up finding fecal material with our cluster sampling design. And finally, recaptures do require substantial effort, so recaptures are essential in deer density estimates, and we didn't have that many, and so but they are really important in trying to do this type of projects. So going forward, if we're going to do more non-invasive sampling, we need to really make sure that we have the legwork in the beginning. And future work, we want to integrate similarity to inform space use and resource selection, and also develop methods to evaluate density versus use. And these are all the folks that I'd like to thank that made this work possible, especially the Wildlife Resources Commission for funding this work, and all the private property owners who allowed access to their properties. I wouldn't have had such a robust project without everybody working together. So thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it over to Micaiah, and she's going to tell you about her project.
All right. Can you guys see my PowerPoint okay? Awesome.
We can.
Lovely. Alrighty. Well, hi, everyone. My name is Micaiah, as Ashley mentioned. And today I'm going to share with you a little bit of my research that focuses on the influence of urbanization on white-tailed deer movement. So kind of jumping right in and adding to what Ashley had mentioned, urbanization is one of the most significant global trends reshaping landscapes and ecosystems in the 21st century. And so as cities expand and human populations grow, undeveloped areas are becoming more fragmented, leading to major ecological shifts. So these two photos were taken recently in our state area, and they kind of illustrate this transformation that we're seeing. So urbanization, we know, affects wildlife in many ways, including habitat loss, shifts in resource availability, and ultimately increased interactions with humans. Although deer are common in urban and suburban areas, relatively little is known about how they navigate these landscapes compared to rural ones. And so understanding these movements can help managers identify high-risk areas for human-wildlife interactions and ultimately inform management strategies. To evaluate the effects of urbanization on deer movement, we ultimately examined how land cover, impervious surface, distance to roads, and time of day all influence movement and resource selection across this gradient. And to do this, we applied a hidden Markov integrated step selection function to kind of model these different movement patterns. These three raster images highlight key covariates that we use within our analysis. So the canopy cover map on the left shows darker green areas representing greater canopy cover, while wider pixels indicate no canopy. The distance to road map in the middle uses a color gradient where darker purple areas indicate shorter distances to roads, while yellow areas represent locations farther from roads. And then lastly, this impervious surface map on the right depicts hot pink areas as highly impervious surfaces, such as roads and buildings, whereas darker areas indicate more pervious, undeveloped landscapes. So as Ashley mentioned earlier, our study area covers Durham County in North Carolina. This region is rapidly urbanizing. We've got large universities and a growing tech industry, making it kind of an ideal location to study how urban expansion affects deer. And so over the last 3 years, we captured and collared white-tailed deer to examine how urbanization impacts various aspects of deer ecology. So to capture deer in urbanized landscapes, we use drop nets and dart guns. And this video you're about to watch illustrates a typical drop net capture. So on the left, our team is stationed in a nearby truck, ready to deploy the net. And then once that net falls and is dropped, our crew rushes in to physically restrain the deer, ensuring that they don't injure themselves or others. Sometimes we get hurt in the process. But each deer is then manually injected with a drug cocktail that allows them to safely fall asleep within a few minutes, making it easier for us to collect data and fit them with their collar. In more rural locations, deer are typically captured using darting. This method is most effective on larger properties, as the immobilization drugs require about 10 minutes to take effect, and during which that time, a deer can cover considerable distances. So greater open space facilitates safe tracking and recovery of darted individuals. So to study deer movement, we tracked individuals across this full urbanization gradient, capturing and collaring deers in locations ranging from dense neighborhoods to rural forests. And this allowed us to examine how configuration of the landscape and urbanization influence deer ecology, specifically focusing on deer movement patterns and resource use, using data from 202 different adults. So after collecting the data, we wanted a way to measure how urban each deer's environment was. And so these panels represent data for 2 different individuals overlaid on an imperviousness raster. And the individual here on the left exists predominantly in like a suburban ex-urban area, while this individual on the right exists in a more densely urban location. So we let the deer's home range define how urban their space was by calculating percent, basically the average impervious surface within their home range. And this gave us what we call an urbanness value for each deer. So for example, this deer on the left's value is 0.8, and the deer on the right has an urbanness value of 21.7. So this is how we objectively included the urbanization gradient into our analysis. To analyze deer movement, we employed a 2-step approach where we first took GPS locations and classified them into latent behavioral states, so either encamped or exploratory, using hidden Markov models. And then we quantified state-specific habitat selection using an integrated step selection function. And then outputs from these different steps were then combined to assess how movement and selection really varied across different levels of urban development. So looking at our first step, we classified movement data into 2 different behavioral states, exploratory and encamped. 4 a priori models, each representing distinct hypotheses, were developed and evaluated for their ability to really classify the data. And then these models really tested for the effects of time of day and the gradient on deer activity. And then we used AIC to ultimately assess model performance to really determine which of these models were the best fit. So the hidden Markov models enabled us to examine deer activity patterns by time of day across 2 different seasons for both males and females, as illustrated here, with time of day plotted along the x-axis, with 0 and 24 representing like midnight and 12 representing noon. The y-axis shows the probability of deer being in an active or an exploratory state. And then each of these plotted lines represent deer along the urbanization gradient. So green lines represent our most rural individuals, purple lines represent our most urban individuals, and yellow represent the mean. Looking at our plotted results, we found that females showed an interesting pattern. Urban females suppressed their activity during the day and actually increased their activity during nighttime hours when compared to rural females. And then looking at the males, we found that they showed a bit of a different strategy, with urban males actually suppressing their activity throughout the entire daily cycle, regardless of time, when compared to those rural individuals who are just generally more active. So our hidden Markov results indicate that as urbanization increases, deer do adjust their activity and movement to minimize exposure to disturbances. Specifically, females reduce their daytime activity, while males actually showed a decrease in overall total activity as urbanization increased. And then quickly moving on to the second step of our analysis, where we conducted an integrated step selection function. For each of our observed steps, we generated 5 random steps to look at how the deer were navigating the landscape. And then we tested 7 competing hypotheses involving landscape covariates, activity state, and urbanization effects on deer movement. And then we ranked each of those models using AIC to identify the best explanation for deer selection. So in addition to daily deer movement, we also looked at how deer selected for different landscape features based on their behavioral state using the step selection functions. And so this figure here shows the selection of the different landscape covariates based on 2 different behavioral states, encamped and exploratory, as shown here by the green and purple lines. The x-axis shows the urbanization gradient, with more rural individuals along the left and more urban individuals along the right of each plot. And then the covariates are listed at the top of each plot, and each plot is also broken out by sex and season. So when we looked at the effects of canopy cover, which was our first column here, on deer selection, we found that as urbanization increased, so as it moves from left to right, selection for canopy cover also increased. However, at low urbanization levels, selection for canopy cover was near 0, suggesting no selection, and sometimes negative, which suggests avoidance for canopy cover. And then when we looked at behavioral states for canopy cover, it kind of seemed to have varying effects on selection, depending on sex and season. When we look at the effects of distances to roads on deer selection, we found that as urbanization increased, again, moving from left to right, deer selected for areas farther from roads in 2 of the 4 comparisons that I've highlighted here with this red box. And so it's probably worth noting in this column, the values above the dotted horizontal lines indicate selection for greater distances from roads, so like more avoidance, while the values below this dotted line indicate selection for shorter distances or maybe attraction. And then looking at overall the states, when deer were in the encamped state, they consistently avoided roads, which are represented here by these green lines. And then when deer were in the exploratory state, so the purple lines, their selection for distance to roads varied from avoidance to positive selection depending on sex, season, and where they lived on the gradient. And then when we look at impervious surfaces, we found that deer avoided impervious surfaces regardless of where they lived along the gradient. However, deer did seem to display decreased avoidance for impervious surfaces as they got more urban. Possibly indicating that, in more urban areas, deer exhibit less avoidance, maybe because they're, coming in contact with more impervious spaces. So when we looked at the behavioral states, we did find that individuals in the encamped state, so the green, did avoid impervious surfaces a little bit less than when they were in the exploratory state. And then as a final quick recap, for canopy cover, deer adjust their habitat selection based on the level of urbanization that's available to them. So in more urban areas, deer show stronger selection for greater green spaces with canopy cover, likely using them as a refuge from human disturbances and infrastructure where impervious surfaces tend to dominate. Whereas rural individuals varied in their selection from canopy cover, which could be a function of more variation in deer habitat. When looking at distances to roads, we found that encamped individuals avoided roads in the exploratory state, and individuals were more often attracted to roadsides. This pattern suggests that roads may act as a disturbance or risk factor, leading deer to avoid them when stationary, but when moving, they may be drawn to resources found near roadsides or concentrated along roads, maybe because they're barriers. And then finally, looking at our impervious surfaces, deer generally avoided them regardless of where they lived. But when we broke this down by movement state, we found that encamped individuals avoided impervious surfaces a little bit less than when in the exploratory state, which could reflect a combination of limited resource availability or heightened risk of encountering humans or vehicles while moving. So with that, I will let Jared take it away. I can figure out how to stop sharing.
Hey everyone. My name is Jared Lamb, and the section of my research that I'll be focusing on today is how the harvest susceptibility of white-tailed deer is affected across the urbanization gradient. Make sure. Before I get started, however, I'd just like to thank everyone that helped me along the way. This includes all the co-authors listed here on the left and the collaborators that made the project possible, including more than the 150 landowners and organizations in Durham and Orange counties that allowed us to work and trap on their property. And this also includes the several technicians that we had over the years in the bottom right that helped us achieve our objectives in the field. And with that being said, I will get right into it. So hunting is an important tool for wildlife management agencies, especially for white-tailed deer, as it's the primary tool used to meet management objectives. However, hunting can be challenged in urbanizing landscapes for a variety of reasons, such as local regulations that may restrict hunting, such as no hunting within city limits, reduction in parcel sizes and undeveloped land that might discourage hunting, as well as overall cultural shifts in urbanizing landscapes that might not permit hunting on properties where it may still be able to occur. This ultimately reduces the amount of huntable lands available, and this may have significant impacts on how white-tailed deer are managed. And huntable lands itself can actually be quantified. And in fact, Connor Burke, who was a previous graduate student here at NC State, in collaboration with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission, developed a statewide map of huntable lands that you see here at the bottom back in 2019. And it highlighted the limited amount of huntable lands in and around urban areas, which further prompted this research into how urbanization impacts the individual harvest susceptibility of white-tailed deer. And so to accomplish our objective, we captured white-tailed deer across the urbanization gradient using drop nets and dart guns, which Micaiah showed earlier. And we equipped these deer with GPS collars from 2022 all the way to 2024. And for my research specifically, we wanted to focus on monitoring the fates of each individual within its first hunting season that it was collared for. Specifically, we monitored whether each deer was harvested, died from a non-harvest related source of mortality, or survived throughout the hunting season. And so we monitored this for each sex and age group across the urbanization gradient found within Durham County and the nearby areas of Orange County where we captured deer. And here you can see where we captured these deer across the county. But more importantly, these maps show where we captured deer in relation to the landscape covariates that we were interested in. On the left is the impervious surface map, which you've seen several times so far, and we use this to quantify an individual urbanist value for each deer by calculating the average impervious surface cover within each deer's home range. And then on the right is a zoomed in and updated version of that huntable lands map that I had mentioned before. And each property parcel has a probability of being hunted. And we took the weighted average of these probabilities within each deer's home range to get a huntable lands value as well for each individual. And with these landscape covariates and the individual covariates of each deer's sex and age, we were able to investigate 4 different models to identify the best covariates that we could use to predict fate during the hunting season. And these models included using sex and age only, using sex, age, and urbanist values to predict fate, using sex, age, and huntable lands values, and then finally using sex, age, urbanist values, and huntable lands values. And shown in this table is our sample size of deer that survived to each individual's first hunting season. One thing to note here is the age is denoted as the age at the time of hunting season rather than at the time of capture. And our female yearling sample size here was low due to difficulties of fitting GPS collars on 7 to 11-month-old fawns of that female fawns of that size, and just overall broader project priorities. And so this plot here shows the fate of each individual deer, which is split by sex and plotted at each individual urbanist value on the x-axis and each huntable lands value on the y-axis. And this plot is pretty busy, but one thing that I want to draw your attention to is the orange points, which represent the harvested individuals. And if you look at the urbanist values of these individuals, you can see that the majority of the orange points are located between urbanist values of 0 and 7. However, if you look at the huntable lands values on these individuals, it ranges from huntable lands values of 0 all the way to 100. And this was further represented during our model selection process, which we used AIC to rank our models. and it ranked urbanist values as the better predictor of fate than huntable lands. And it also included sex and age in that model. Therefore, we present the rest of our results using the model of fate as a function of sex, age, and urbanist value. And here you can see where each fate occurred spatially across the county and at different levels of urbanization. You can note the more rural harvest locations on the left and how non-harvest mortalities, which were primarily vehicle collisions in this case, occurred across the county, but primarily near major freeways and higher impervious areas in the middle. And then, of course, survival happened all across the county. Using this data and results from our top model, we're able to predict the probability of each fate at each urbanist value that we observed. And this allowed us to get a better understanding of the effect of urbanization on harvest susceptibility and overall fate during the hunting season. And so here are the results from these predictions. I'm going to break down this plot a little bit. These are stacked area charts that show the urbanization gradient of urbanist values on the x-axis with the probability of each fate on the y-axis. The columns denote the sex with males on the left and females on the right, and the rows denote the age with adults up top and the yearlings below. Survival probability is represented by black, harvest is represented by orange, and non-harvest mortality is represented by the blue area. The probability of each fate is represented by the total area of each color at that given urbanization value, and the sum of each fate combined sums to 1, which allows us to visualize not only how these fates interact with the urbanization gradient, but also with each fate. And so in the top left, we can start with adult males, and you can see that they had the highest harvest susceptibility of each sex and age group, but the harvest susceptibility declined significantly as urbanization increased, and this relationship was evident across each sex and age group at different levels. The probability of non-harvest mortality, which again was primarily deer vehicle collisions, were highest for yearling males, and this was primarily due to the increased vehicle collisions during the fall dispersal period and during the rut. And interestingly, this nearly offset the reduction in harvest as urbanization increased, which resulted in nearly constant survival across the gradient. And this offset can also be seen in yearling females with a very low harvest susceptibility. And then we can focus our attention to the top right with adult females and see that survival probability increased across the urbanization gradient as harvest susceptibility declined. And this can hold important implications that need to be further investigated, as adult females are the main drivers of population growth in white-tailed deer. Additionally, with these probabilities, we can then reproject them across the county to identify spatially how harvest susceptibility varied across Durham County. And when we plotted the adult males and adult females, we could really visualize the complexity of how harvest susceptibility can vary even within areas considered more urban and suburban near the city center. So in conclusion, the main take-homes of this research are that harvest susceptibility declined as urbanization increased. However, the effect of urbanization on harvest and overall survival varied among different sex and age groups. And then the next steps that we can apply with this research is to evaluate what these results mean for overall population growth rates of white-tailed deer. And we can accomplish this by looking at annual survival of neonate and adult deer, as well as reproductive rates to identify how population growth rates vary across the urbanization gradient. And this is the second chapter of what my research is focused on. And with that being said, that's all from me. Thank you for your time, and I will pass it on to Hannah.
Awesome. Okay, let me pull it up. All right, great. So I assume everyone can see my slides, but I'm sure someone will stop me if I start and you can't. I'm going to be wrapping things up here with a discussion of the project from a more human-focused angle. So I'll be talking first about white-tailed deer management acceptance before talking a little bit more in depth about predicting huntable lands, which Jared mentioned with his presentation. So thanks for the setup there. Oh, here we go. Okay, so with that white-tailed deer management, first, I'll be talking about it from an urban to rural gradient before diving into a model comparison of that 2017 model that Jared mentioned from Connor Burke to the updated 2025 version. And then given time, I'll be talking about another version of that huntable land model where we take into consideration both the landscape variables and landowner variables. So to first visualize what I mean when I say urban in this context, we used urban, suburban, and rural classifications of Durham County using the Durham County GIS zoning definitions. So this is a little bit different than what you've been seeing so far with that urban definition, just because our objective had this social element. So we were looking for a social construct rather than a structural one. So using this zoning definition, we're able to get sort of this people-focused version of what urban, suburban, and rural means, and use that to categorize our responses. So we sent out a survey where we asked respondents to rank different management strategies for white-tailed deer on a scale from very unacceptable to very acceptable, 1 through 5. So each of these 6 options were given in a table and they were ranked separately. So there was no sort of comparison here or pick which one is best. They were each ranked on acceptability. And we ended up grouping them into these 3 broader management strategy contexts. So first was hunting, which included both archery and firearm hunting. Then we had a category we called lethal professionals, which included both trained sharpshooters as well as drugging and euthanizing the deer. And then the final category here was passive management. So either letting nature take its course without human interference or educating people about living responsibly with deer. So with these 3 categories, we looked at the differences in acceptability across.
Hey, Hannah, you've become muted.
Sorry about that. So did you see the last slide or hear the last slide?
If you start at the beginning of this slide, I think we'll be good.
Awesome. Okay. All right. So we took the responses to those management options and we looked at it across that landscape with that map I showed earlier. And we saw differences in acceptance of management strategies from the people who lived in these different areas of Durham County. So specifically with passive management and the hunting, we saw that hunting acceptability decreased among respondents in suburban and urban areas compared to those who lived in the more rural areas. And we saw the opposite trend there with passive management. So interestingly, we didn't see much of a difference here with that lethal professional management acceptance. So it's not necessarily the lethal versus non-lethal aspect that's changing across the landscape. There's something specific here with hunting and with passive management. So it's important to understand how people feel about the acceptability of different management because it impacts the implementation of management across the landscapes when it comes to like the support of the people who live in those areas. So this is a very broad overview of that management acceptability. And then I want to jump into sorry, the mute is too close to the click next button. So I apologize for that. So if you have any questions about the management acceptability, I'd be happy to go into more detail toward the end when it comes to questions. But to get a little bit more of an overview here about the huntable lands model, Jared talked about Connor's version from 2017. So that version of the huntable lands model, the goal was to use these readily available landscape variables like parcel size, housing density, and road density to create a predictive model to say whether or not a parcel was hunted. So the main update we were looking to do was to include these urban areas because that original model excluded municipalities from the start. So we're missing a lot of information about these urban areas across the state, but specifically here, we're looking at Durham County as sort of a proxy to see what the model would look like when we included those areas. So I'll be talking about the old model versus the new model, but I also wanted to mention that each of those models are actually a composition of both industrial and non-industrial models. So it's very comprehensive because we're looking at every single parcel across the state, whether or not it was business owned or resident owned. So the actual variables for these two models were pretty similar, with the main driver being property size for both, and both included both housing density and road density. So the only difference in terms of the input variables here was that distance to the nearest municipality was important for the industrial part of the model from 2017. So the input variables themselves were the same, but we do see differences in the actual model, the model numbers and coefficients, which we wanted to test to see if we were to put the old model information into our current information. So from that survey that I mentioned, we know which parcels are hunted. So we took the model equation from that 2017 model, input the information for the current housing density, road density, and parcel size, and asked it to give us that probability that each parcel was hunted. And we saw that if we used that old model, we only got accuracy versus like the known hunted parcels from our survey of about 20% versus about 88% for our updated model. So I wanted to mention with a disclaimer here, this is still very preliminary, and it is just looking at one county when the original model was built for the whole state. So we can't draw any huge conclusions from this just yet, but it appears that the old model that is currently in use that excluded these municipalities may not be super accurate when we start to look at more urbanized areas. And then just to visualize here what that looks like, this is a mapped version of our huntable lands probabilities. So the darker blue here is a higher probability of that parcel being hunted. So we're seeing it's pretty similar to our rural, suburban, and urban breakdown here, with the outer edges of the county more likely to be hunted based on this model. And then in addition to that updated version of the model using landscape variables, we built a version of this huntable land model that included both the physical barriers to hunting, which are those landscape variables, as well as potential landowner barriers to hunting. So we used demographic input from that survey in addition to these landscape variables to see if there was a difference in terms of who is making that decision about that individual parcel. And we did see that the landscape variables still reigned here, especially property size was the biggest input variable and predictor for whether or not a parcel was hunted. So as property size increased, it was more likely to be hunted. And then road density was also important in this version of the model. So as road density increased, the property was less likely to be hunted. But in addition, we did see some important landowner variables in this version of the model, specifically political identity, with respondents who are more conservative being more likely to have a parcel that was hunted versus a respondent that was more liberal. And with gender, so a male landowner was more likely to have a hunted parcel than a female landowner. And then finally with age. So as age increases, so does the probability of being hunted. So in terms of actionable insights from this version of the model, it's still important to have or to identify large parcels, but it might also be important to tailor outreach and communication strategies for landowners. So for liberal identifying landowners, for example, it would be important to emphasize the ecological benefits of hunting and address specific safety concerns versus, like, in contrast, for a conservative identifying landowner who might already exhibit high levels of support for hunting and hunting land access, outreach efforts may be more effective if they focus on logistical barriers like connecting landowners with interested hunters. And then in addition, targeted programs aimed at engaging specifically female and younger landowners could help bridge existing gaps and increase land access for hunting. So I believe that should wrap up my time here. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer at the end of the meeting here, or you can send me an email here. Thank you.
All right, thank you to all of our presenters. Those were great presentations, covered a really broad range and well represented the breadth of this research project that has been going on over the last several years. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and drop them into the chat. We'll read them out to our presenters. I'll start with one. I have one for Ashley, because I'm genetics, so that's where we're going to go first. But I was wondering about your heat map and how that might be expanded to beyond Durham County, if there are caveats to doing that, or if you've done any exploration of expanding that heat map statewide to get a state density estimate.
So I haven't explored that personally, but it's possible as long as we have the spatial information. So we have parcel data and everything for the whole county, so that's easily done. The problem is extrapolating the actual deer density that we have as far as modeling. So if there was some way to kind of make that averaged out, or if we can get it into a couple different areas of the county, then we can extrapolate to the whole county. But I haven't explored that, but it's possible with some modeling for sure.
Great. And Micaiah, this is a more general question. But I was just curious as to all the things that you learned from that telemetry study. What did you find to be the most surprising thing?
I think the most surprising thing for me, in particular for what I presented on today, is probably our results with when we look at how deer maybe avoid impervious surfaces. Our results kind of showed that when deer were in the encamped state, so more sedentary behavior, they actually were more likely to be closer or avoid roads or impervious surfaces less than when they were exploratory. So I think that was, to me, and is still a bit of a head scratcher that I need to kind of disentangle, I think, a little bit more as to why. But that's probably the biggest, is just why are deer, when they're a little bit, more encamped, why are they okay with impervious surfaces a little bit more than when they're not?
Great. So you guys talked a lot about impervious surfaces throughout your presentations. Did you explore any other factors that might be influencing deer movement or deer density? And if so, what did you find? I'll just open that up to whoever wants to take that one.
So we actually did it between females and males, and we actually had a pilot study in the summer of 2022 before this huge project that I presented on, and we actually found differences in densities between males and females versus summer and winter. So that was pretty cool to see that we had some preliminary data going in that we saw sex differences with density, which we assume, but it's cool to see that actually in the data and the seasonal differences too.
Great. Okay, question for Jared. So given your results showing increased survival for females versus males, do you think that enough females are being harvested?
That really depends on the management outcomes. A lot of the problems with modern deer management is kind of reducing populations, as they can be overpopulated subjectively in urban and suburban communities. And the declining harvest susceptibility across the urbanization gradient could be discouraging, but it would have to be applied and tailored to specific areas and what the management objectives actually are.
Okay. I had a couple of comments. Fallon said, I feel like vegetation measures beyond canopy cover, especially understory and midstory density, could have some real explanatory power for some of these trends. And John Shaw said, political affiliation seems to be an important factor in whether a property is hunted. What's the best way to determine political affiliation prior to working or approaching a landowner?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's important beyond sort of just the huntable land aspect. I didn't have time to present that today, but we did a predictive model with management acceptance as well, and political identity was an important predictor there as well. In terms of individual landowner, there's not really a way to approach somebody knowing their political affiliation ahead of time. So it's going to be more of a general communication trend and sort of varying how you approach both like specific targeted programs and communication outreach efforts. So maybe having some that are more focused on ecological benefits and some being more direct. But one-on-one with a landowner, it's going to be a little tricky, at least at this point, because you don't know somebody's political affiliation going in.
And I'm sorry if I missed this. Did you include those demographic data into your huntable lands model in this iteration?
So the goal with the updated, like the comparison huntable land model, was to have very readily available data. So we only used the landscape level variables for that one. But the second one that I mentioned was a sort of just exploratory interest version of the model, which included both the landscape and those demographics. So that one wasn't the one we were extrapolating for the whole county and creating that map. It was more with the survey data we got, what were the predictors that were going in that could potentially predict whether or not the parcel was hunted.
Okay, thank you for that.
Yeah.
Okay, oh, one other question coming in. Jared, were there any obvious differences in the type of roads where vehicle kills occurred when looking across the urban to rural gradient, or was it just a matter of road density?
Yeah, so just looking at raw data and actually going and collecting a lot of those vehicle collision mortalities and doing the necropsy myself out in the field, especially during the fall, a lot more vehicle collisions happened on more primary roads. We had several occur through interstates during the rut period, as well as major freeways, like in Durham County specifically. 501 is a 4-lane highway running north to south. Durham Freeway is more of a interstate style road, but definitely those higher speed limit roads. But with that being said, we definitely had vehicle collision mortalities on lower speed limit roads, which could be surprising. We haven't looked specifically at road density in terms of vehicle collisions yet, but that's something that we'll have to take a look at.
All righty. So with that, we'll say thank you again to our presenters. We really appreciate you guys taking the time to come and present the results of this study. And everyone, join us again next month when we will have Mike Walter presenting on the conservation of the federally endangered Tar River spiny mussel. So we'll see everyone next month. Thanks.